Hello,
Hi
everyone, and
everyone.
welcome back to our second week of the bread making series. I'm Kimmy,
I'm Miranda.
and today we're going to be going over the second process. So, if you guys were able to join us last week, we made our very own homemade starter. Miranda, did you want to show your starter?
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
so this is the one that we made last week.
Yeah, and this is mine, and you can see that it's full of lots of bubbles and it's doing really well. It's very healthy and lots of activity. And if you guys want, you can go ahead and put in the chat, where are these bubbles coming from? Are they just magically appearing? What's happening and what's making those all appear? And so today we're going to be going over the second half of the process of making bread. So now that we have our starter, today we're going to be going through the mixing process and going ahead and showing you how to start folding as well. And so you can really develop your dough from there. And so some of the materials you're going to need are you're going to need flour, water, just like last time, but in addition, you're also going to need some salt. And so here are all of the quantities that we'll be using today. And this is going to make roughly one loaf, but you can also double it, and that will work as well if you just want some extra bread along with it. So while you guys go ahead and collect that, Miranda, how's your week been?
It's been pretty good. I had a math test on Friday, so I've been studying for that, and I'm kind of nervous. But other than that, everything's going well. What about you, Kimmy?
I'm a little bit stressed, but that's just because college apps are coming up this weekend, but I think I'm
Um,
getting through it. So it's nice to take a little bit of break from school and make some bread, which is something that
it
I
really
truly
is.
enjoy. Yeah.
I've been looking forward to making this all week.
Yeah, for sure. And not only is it like fun to make, but you get a great byproduct of bread. So can't really complain, can you?
It's a win-win.
All right, so as you guys are collecting this, normally what you do at this point is test your starter to make sure that it's all good and ready to use. And you can kind of actually, a little pro tip to kind of incorporate that into the process is normally what you do is you're testing with something called the float test, meaning that like the starter is going to float on top of water. And that's because there are so many bubbles that it's going to be like lighter than the water itself. And so one little tip on how to do this without wasting another jar or any of your starter is just while you're mixing, putting in your ingredients, just put in your water first, and then you can do the float test as you simultaneously measure out the amount of starter that you need. So today, for this first half, I'm going to be instructing Miranda through all the steps, and then I'm going to be showing the folding process in the second half. So Miranda, did you want to go ahead and add your water?
Yeah, so Kimmy helped me measure out the ingredients for um, this part of the process just because, as she's mentioned before, baking is sort of a science, and the way that you measure flour by volume can differ because of things such as humidity in the room or just how tight you pack the flour. So she measured it by grams for me. But if you don't have a scale, you can always use an online converter, and that'll still work. Hopefully, there just might be some fluctuations in the recipe. So here's my 500 grams, or I think less, of water.
Yeah. And so now what we could do is kind of do the float test. It'll probably be hard to see, especially since Miranda's water line is like pretty shallow. But basically what you would do is you just scoop out a little bit of your starter and try to gently place it on top of your water as best you can. And sometimes it'll float, sometimes it'll float for a second and then maybe sink down. Just really try to make sure you're getting as gentle as possible. And oftentimes it won't actually float. But if you're looking at your starter and it's clear that there's lots of activity and that it's really going strong, your bread should turn out just fine. So
All right.
Miranda, do you want to go ahead and give that a try? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then while she's doing that, I'm going to be a little bit ahead in the process. So you guys are getting a little bit of a sneak peek into the future. But I do already have my dough done. And right now is just about the time for me to add the salt. So that's what I'll be doing in the background and while Miranda does her float test.
Yeah. So I actually borrowed some of Kimmy's starter for today just because it's been a little cold in the past couple of days and mine isn't quite ready yet. So as you can see, the starter is more developed. It's really bubbly on the sides. And so I'll just be taking a little amount. Do you think this is good, Kimmy?
Just anything that when you try to get off a little bit, and just have it be like a little droplet, and then you can just try to lay it as carefully as you can on top of the water. So just go ahead and scrape a little bit off with your finger and just try to get it off. Yeah.
Right.
And so, like we said, it might be kind of hard to see, and it might not float forever, and but it doesn't matter as long as it's nice and bubbly, which we can see that it is. It should work out just fine.
Yeah. So it seems like today the starter didn't float. It's sort of near the bottom, but as Kimi said, it's a very bubbly starter, and we have faith, even though it doesn't necessarily pass the float test, that they'll still be able to produce some bread.
Mm-hmm. And like we kind of mentioned earlier too, there are lots of other factors that can affect your bread on a day-to-day basis. And one of those factors is temperature, and it has been cooling off these past couple of days. So that means that the enzymes are just going to be working a little slower and maybe not producing quite as many bubbles as normal. And that could be why maybe today it's not floating.
Yeah. Right. So I've been keeping my starter with me in my room because I think it's a little warmer in there, and hopefully in a couple of days it'll be ready.
Yeah. And so now that you've added your water, go ahead and actually measure out the right amount of starter. So if you're doing it by weight, it's going to be around 5.5 or 6 grams of starter. And if you're doing it by volume, it's going to be around anywhere from half a teaspoon to maybe 1 teaspoon-ish, anywhere in between there, depending on how bubbly yours is. So Miranda, have you already measured that out into it?
Yeah, so this is actually the right amount of water. I'd probably put in about 3/4 of a teaspoon of starter from the float test. So I actually think this will be good to go.
Perfect.
What will we be putting in next?
So next, it's going to be the bulk of your dough, and that's going to be all of your flour. So go ahead and first just start with your all-purpose flour, which is going to be around 423 grams, I believe, of all-purpose flour. And go ahead and just dump the whole thing in. No need to be mixing it in at the same time. But you can see that's quite a big jump from just water. Yeah. And you can just imagine, normally I do it in my household in batches of 2. So it'll actually normally be double that, which is much bigger. And
I don't even think I have a bowl big enough for that.
If you put it in this bowl, it almost makes like a little mound when all the flour is done. So it's quite a precarious situation. But after you've done your all-purpose, the next is the rye flour. And so the reason that we have the secondary flour, sometimes people also use bread flours, it just has it helps develop the structure and make it even stronger. But if you guys don't have it, you guys are free to just use all-purpose flour. So just add that 18 grams of all-purpose flour, or in our case, a rye flour. Yeah, and so then after that, that is actually all the ingredients that go into bread. Super simple, no eggs, no oil. This is all you need. And you can kind of tell, yeah, it's kind of funny how it's almost the exact same as the starter, but it's just on such a bigger scale, and it's just hasn't had time to sit and ferment. But all in all, bread is super simple, and there's really not much to it. It's just all about ratios.
That's crazy. It's like a big starter.
Exactly. And so what we're going to be doing next is we're going to just incorporating it as best we can. And you guys are free to do this by hand, though it is going to take some serious elbow grease. But if you guys are up for the task, you can go ahead and do it by hand. But Miranda, do you have a hand mixer on hand?
I do have a hand mixer, so I'll actually be switching my angle because the cord is a little short. But yeah.
Yeah. And so this is, yeah. And so you're just going to go ahead and mix it as best you can. A lot of times people are going to have the mixers that Miranda has there. And if you guys really get into bread making one day, you guys can even get special dough mixers. And that's just going to make it, because you see how Miranda's kind of shaped like a whisk, right? There's kind of a hole in the middle, and sometimes dough gets stuck in there. So what people have cleverly invented are a little mixer that is just like a spiral. And then that way no dough ever gets stuck in the middle. But this should work just fine. You just might have to scrape out a little bit from the middle, but that is no problem at all.
All right.
And so yeah, if it's a little loud, Miranda might mute herself here.
Yeah, I might actually mute my microphone just so that you guys don't have to listen to me whisk.
Yeah. But what is going to be super cool is we're going to see a lot of texture changes in the dough itself. So right now, obviously, nothing is incorporated, just flour and water. And as she starts to mix it together, it's going to change texture a little bit. Obviously, it's going to start to incorporate, but it's not going to become like a batter, like a pancake dough, right? It's not going to be perfectly smooth and nice and shiny. What's going to happen first is it's going to get a little shaggy almost. It's going to have, it's going to be look almost crumbly at first. She first starts to incorporate it, but as she keeps on going, the gluten structure is going to keep on developing and keep on getting stronger, and it's going to really form a cohesive dough by the end. And as she keeps on doing that, there's even going to be one other transformation later that we sort of touched on is when you add the salt. And so what's happening when you're mixing, do you see that shaggy texture, how it looks almost crumbly? That's kind of the first step that you're going to see. And so you just got to keep on going. It's not fully incorporated yet. Because it's shaggy means that there's like flour coating the outside. And as she continues to do that, it's going to go ahead and incorporate even more. And eventually you're going to come up with a dough that sort of looks like what I have here, except it might be a little bit less smooth and it might be a little less tough than it is right here. And that's because I have already gone through the extra step of adding the salt, which we'll touch on later. But basically what she's doing while you're mixing all of the ingredients together is you're strengthening that gluten structure. And gluten is basically all these little proteins, and these proteins create this structure when it's mixed with water and flour. And the kneading or the mixing is like kind of loosening them up. They're kind of, normally they're really tightly bound, but when you're mixing it or when you knead bread, it's kind of loosening it all up and making them more relaxed. And that kind of strengthens the structure because they're able to like connect with each other and they're able to build this network of connections between each other. And so that's what happens as you mix it. And Miranda, did you want to update us on the texture? Has it changed at all?
Sorry, let me unmute my microphone so you guys can hear me. But yeah, so the dough is looking a lot more formed now. It's like kind of, I guess, doughy and sticky. So before, you were right, like every piece was coated in flour, but now it's looking a lot more mixed. And it's also gotten a lot tougher. So I might actually take the hand mixer out.
Yeah, so, and you can see that her dough and my dough still have a lot of differences. Even though hers is basically all incorporated, that's basically what yours should look like at this stage. It should be all incorporated, unlike when it is all separated before, but it should be kind of lumpy. It will be a little irregular. And if you like touched it, it'll probably stick to your finger and you'll probably have to wash your hands. Yeah. And so at this point, you're basically done with the mixing stage. And so what Miranda's going to do is go ahead and just leave it to the side for about 15 minutes. And if you guys are following along at home, you guys are going to do the same. And then after 15 minutes, you're going to add the salt. And the reason why we wait is because the salt kind of stops all the formation of, or kind of like hurts the formation of the structure. And so what we're going to do is just wait for a little bit and let it kind of develop its first structure at first. And then we're going to go ahead and add the salt. And if you're having the recipe like us, it's going to be around 7 grams of salt. And it's really good also to get the finest salt you have. So I always use as like fine of salt I can, just so that it incorporates as easy and as thoroughly as possible. And so you can see that you saw a little sneak peek earlier, but basically this dough is the exact same as Miranda's, only with the salt added. And you can see how it's so much smoother. You can see how it's not sticking to the spatula. It's basically tearing away perfectly. And that's kind of what it's going to be looking like after you add the salt into your dough. And what we're going to do now is after you thoroughly mix it in, I did it by hand slowly just over these last couple of minutes while I was talking with Miranda, but you guys can also use a hand mixer for this stage, and that'll just help make it extra thorough and extra evenly distributed. And so I added the salt to this around 4 o'clock. And so you're going to remember like 15-minute increments are going to be kind of like your golden spot. So after you mix all the ingredients together, you're going to wait 15 minutes and then you're going to add the salt. You're going to wait another 15 minutes and then we're going to start doing the folding process. And so I'm going to go ahead and walk you guys through how to fold your dough once you get to this stage. And so what's going to be helpful is if you actually get some water or go by your sink and just sort of wet your hands. It's just going to make it so your hands are a little less sticky and it's just a little easier to work with the dough. And so what we're going to see at first is as we pull it, it doesn't go very far. You see it kind of stops. I can't really pull it. It's definitely stretchier than previous stages, but it's still pretty tough. Yeah. And it will like soften over time. And as you fold it, it's going to keep on getting more elastic and more pliable. And the technique for folding, at least for me, is if you want to switch to my close cam, you can see what I'll do is you sort of take one side and then I sort of stretch it up as far as you can, going back and forth as much as you can. And then you go ahead and fold it over and kind of tuck it in the front. And then you're going to rotate it from another angle and you're going to pick up the back again and sort of stretch it out and get it as tall as you can and then fold it back. And you're going to see the longer you go on, the stickier it is. So you might need to wet your hands again just to make it a little bit less sticky. And you're going to continue doing that. You normally go like once around or maybe twice around with your folding rotations. And you can see that even within one kind of folding rotation, it's going to be getting a lot more elastic and just a lot easier to work with. And it's going to be more cohesive than it was before. And once you're done, just like that, you're going to go ahead and leave it for another 15 minutes. And you can really leave it for like 10 to 20, sometimes even 30 minutes at a time in increments. But generally, I like to just keep the rule of 15 minutes because then you know between like mixing, between salt, between folds, if it's all 15 minutes, it's so much easier to remember.
Wow. So what's the significance in folding it in that really specific way, Kimi?
Yeah, I don't think there's necessarily a science between folding it that way. I think it's just you get to work on a more concentrated area at a time and really make sure that like every part of the bread is or every part of the dough is getting that stretching out and making sure that all those gluten structures are developing. And the fact that you do like once at a time and rotate it and you do that multiple times, it's a pretty guaranteed thing that you're going to make sure you're getting all sides covered.
Awesome. Yeah. All right. And so what happens after this next 15 minutes of waiting?
Yeah, so after after you wait for 15 minutes, you're going to go ahead and add the salt and then start the folding process like me. And for me, what I'm going to do after the next 15 minutes is I'm just going to repeat that process again. I'm going to fold it again and I'm going to repeat that 3 or 4 times. And it kind of comes with time, but you'll see that like at some point your bread is just so much stretchier. You can see that right now. I can grab it up to about here, but eventually it'll be maybe even double that. And so you'll be able to stretch it so much farther and you'll really see like, oh, like it's time to let it be. And so at that point, once it's all stretched out and you think it's at a good point, you're going to go ahead and leave that to rest before you bake it. And we have linked the recipe in the description. So you guys can go ahead and continue following along even after this live event. And that is going to walk you guys through how to shape and bake your bread as well.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds awesome. Yeah, so right now my dough is pretty stiff, but after 15 minutes, do you think it will have risen a bit and become stretchier?
Yeah, it should definitely become a little stretchier. And I think the biggest change is when you're going to add your dough or add your salt to your dough. And that's when like it's almost magical. You see this like kind of disjointed dough. You add this one thing, mix it together, and it becomes so smooth and so cohesive. And it's kind of crazy how fast it can change, even just with one ingredient. Yeah, but it's really important to wait to add the salt. Yeah. And so what we're basically doing during like the resting periods as well is the yeast, all of that bubbly starter we added at the beginning is still going strong and it's still doing its magic, because after all, the bubbles are what gives us the bubbles in our final bread loaf. And so they're still at work, they're still there. Might be a little harder to see, obviously, but they're still there going strong. And then over this past week, as we let it just go ahead and develop, it was fermenting. And then Miranda, did you know anything about fermenting?
Yeah, so fermentation is a cellular process that happens when there is no oxygen, but organisms still need to produce energy. So we talked about this a little bit in our last live stream, if you guys were there, but I mentioned how, let's say you're running really fast and afterwards your muscles start burning and they get very sore. So that's because your muscles require so much oxygen that your body can't keep up. So you can't do the normal type of cellular respiration that you do. And instead, your muscle cells start performing fermentation, which is what the yeast does. So the fermentation causes a lactic acid buildup, which causes you to become sore. And lactic acid is, as like the name suggests, acidic. So we don't want to produce that much of it. So normally our bodies will use cellular respiration, but a lot of other organisms actually just live off of lactic acid fermentation, such as yeast.
That's so cool. It's funny how through evolution, like we all have these different combos of different processes we use, and like so many complex things have been developed, even though we're all on the same planet together.
Yeah. Everything is connected.
Yeah, it really is. And so at this point, you can see, even in like, it's been only 5 minutes basically since I last folded my dough, but you guys can already see that it's a lot more elastic than it was. Do you see how much higher I can go with it? And that's simply just because it's had more time to relax and really incorporate. And so maybe I'll even just do a little bit of a second folding. And it's just going to keep on getting smoother, stretchier as time goes on. So just keep at it. Remember just the golden rule of 15-minute increments in between each of your folds, and do that 3 or 4 times, and you should be golden.
Awesome. That sounds like a plan.
Yeah, and just like as one last little thing about like some of the science is that like as fermentation is going on, the reason that like flour and water and like all this produces so much magic is because of like the starches in flour, and that is allowed, like that's what the yeast is like converting and is like converting, and that's what it's eating, and then that's what it's producing all of these beautiful gas bubbles for us to use and use in our beautiful bread. Yeah.
That's really cool.
Did you have any questions for the future, or if any of you guys have any questions in the chat, go ahead and put them there and we would be happy to answer them.
So I have a question really quick, Kimi, which is once we bake this loaf of bread and we have our starter still going, should we still keep replenishing it every day? Can we leave it in the fridge and give it a little break? What's the upkeep on that?
Yeah, so I know that if you guys are following along at home, you guys were hopefully like feeding it every time you saw signs of fermentation, which is roughly every day, which is a lot of work. And we definitely don't expect you guys to like have to keep doing that forever every time you want bread. So basically why we had to be so careful with it at the beginning is because it's young. It's still figuring things out, you know, it's not quite sure how to do all this stuff. So you just have to give it some extra attention. But after a week or so, you should see that like it's rising and it's sinking, and its bubble production should pretty much even out. Maybe throughout the week, you saw some days were really productive, some days weren't. And like I said, it was just figuring it out. But now that it's sort of like more stable, it kind of knows what it's doing, it's a lot lower maintenance. So if you guys leave it out on your counter, you guys are still going to have to like feed it and take care of it as often as you can, just because it's like it's going through and it's eating everything there, right? And if you leave it out on the counter, it's going to happen pretty quickly. And if you just stop feeding it, it's just not going to have food, and then eventually the yeast is just going to die. But what you can do to make sure that your starter lasts even longer with less maintenance is you can go ahead and pop it in the fridge. And so what this is going to do is basically just slow everything down. So the enzymes are going to eat a little bit slower. Everything's just going to slow down, but everything will stay living and working inside. So if you put it in the fridge, you probably only need to feed it about once a week instead of every day. And sometimes, you know, if you forget, like it's going to be fine if you give it a couple extra days without food, and it should be just fine. Just try to make sure that you're feeding it, just keeping it healthy, and you'll kind of learn and you'll be able to, if you develop a real relationship with your starter, you know when it's like doing
Oh
well,
yeah.
and yeah. So yeah. Any other questions for upkeep?
All right, so I have another question, which is,
Mhm.
with the sample of your working starter, do you think I'll be able to make a new yeast colony if mine isn't working?
Yeah, you can definitely start it. In fact, I know a lot of people who just like give each other their starters and start from scratch there. And so our original starter actually wasn't our own, it was actually a family friend's. So
Oh, that's so
what
cute.
happens? Yeah, so it's kind of like a little piece of you with someone else. But you can definitely go ahead and start a new batch with the little sample that I gave you. It'll be the exact same process. It's just as if you had made it. So just feed it when you see signs of fermentation, and eventually it will blossom into a great working starter.
Sounds amazing. I definitely plan on doing that.
Yeah. And just like it's the kind of good practice just to like keep track of like how much is in your starter, and just make sure that you like kind of know how much is there, so you make sure that you're giving it plenty of food, because there should always be more food and water than the original starter itself, just because it's eating a lot and you got to make sure that you're giving it enough. Mm-hmm.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions?
And you guys can always leave questions in the chat, and if we don't get to it right now, we'll get to it right after this live stream. But other than that, we hope you enjoyed, and just remember, after you have mixed it to this stage, remember the 15-minute golden rule and just keep folding it every 15 minutes, and then you can follow the instructions down below to make sure that you get the rest of the recipe.
Sounds like a
Awesome.
plan. It's almost time for me to add my salt, so I'll definitely be doing that right after.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us, for all of you that were here, and we hope to see you at a future live event. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. I hope you make good bread.